I have a fascination with plane crashes. Fueled by TV shows like Air Crash Investigations, I Shouldn't Be Alive, and Seconds from Disaster. Among the hundreds of crashes I've learned about, a few have become what I refer to as my favorites. In spite of my morbid tendencies, my favorite stories are of the ones where, against all odds, everyone makes it out alive. But these two stories are my favorite because not only when it seems like the story is over, a new ordeal pops up and the unlucky people have to go through everything to survive again in spite of the odds. So, in contrast to any plane crash video I make in the future, in the words of the doctor, everyone lives just this once. Everyone lives. Hi, my name is Shelby, and this is Merrily Morbid, the channel where we explore all things that are at least a little bit dark. From deadly diseases to natural disasters, from true crime to man made catastrophes. So, if that's your kind of thing, come along and let's get morbid. One clear morning in January of 2002, Justin Kirkbride took his friend Tommy and Tommy's brother in law, Larry, up in his plane over the Colorado Rockies for a sightseeing tour. They took off from a small airport in New Mexico, and their flight plan would have them back at the airport in time for lunch. But if I'm talking about it in a video, then you know that they would in fact not be back in time for lunch. For the first hour of the trip, everything was perfect. They were enjoying the majestic sights. The snow glistened from the sunlight shining down from the abundantly blue sky. After about an hour of flying, they decided to change up their course and head higher up into the mountains with the plan to go up and over. As the mountain slopes grew closer, Justin checked the altimeter to make sure that they were gaining enough altitude to make it up and over the mountain. But he was shocked to see that they were actually losing altitude and they were descending around 800 feet per minute. They unknowingly had flown into a downdraft that was forcing the small plane downward. That has to be terrifying. You just see the mountain getting bigger and bigger. Justin immediately tried to turn the plane out of the valley, but that resulted in a very loud and foreboding stall warning. If they weren't scared before, they were then. But for those of you who don't know what I'm talking about, this is what they would hear. What that meant was that there was not enough air going over the wings of the plane, and without that, poof, the plane falls out of the sky. At that point, Justin knew that there was nothing that he could do to actually stop the plane from crashing. He tried to at least mitigate the damage and hopefully cheat death by slowing the plane down as much as he could without causing the stall warning to sound again. Within seconds, the plane began hitting trees, and then there was silence. Miraculously, all three men survived the initial crash. Tommy and Larry had injuries, but astonishingly, Justin was completely unharmed. But the real ordeal had just begun. Would they survive the crash only to die from their injuries or exposure? Justin jumped into assessing their situation. He saw that the plane had suffered a major fuel leak in the crash and that it was spraying fuel everywhere, drenching the plane. He knew that if for some reason as much as a spark was made, the entire plane would be instantly engulfed in flames with them inside. The plane could even explode. So, without a second thought, Justin turned to Larry and yelled for him to get out. But Larry had sustained a terrible leg injury on impact and yelled back that he was in far too much pain to move. Justin came back with, "If you don't want to burn to death, then you're going to have to get over it." Larry found that as motivation enough and got himself out. With Larry out, Justin turned his attention to Tommy, who was knocked out cold. Justin made his way back to Tommy and tried to wake him up to no avail. So he began pulling Tommy and managed to get him to the window. But as he yanked him out of the window, Tommy's ribs cracked, and that definitely woke him up. Once all three were outside the plane, they were really able to get a grasp on their situation. Tommy had a pretty good head injury along with the broken ribs, and Larry had a badly broken lower leg and ankle. It was impossible to tell if that was the extent of their injuries, but one thing was certain: neither of them was going anywhere. Justin realized that it was up to him to save his friends. His first thought was to try the plane's radio, but that would mean going back into the fuel-soaked plane. Big risk. It was completely possible that when he switched the plane's radio on, that it would create a spark, igniting the plane with him inside. But believing that he had no other choice, he climbed back inside the plane, took a deep breath, and flipped the switch. And nothing happened, except for the sound of static started coming from the radio. Justin made the Mayday call, but he heard no response. He sat there, frustrated and scared. Because of the state of the plane, there was no guarantee that the radio was actually working. No guarantee that anyone actually heard his call. But Justin didn't have time to wallow. Since they had changed their flight path, no one knew where they were or even if they had crashed at all. No one was coming to find them, so it was up to him to save all of them. Just like that, without any food or equipment or water, Justin told his friends that he was going to have to get help. And he began the long hike out of the mountains. Now, his goal was to reach Durango, which they had just flown over just before the crash. He thought maybe it was about 15 miles or so. But Justin knew that he had to make it there before dark when the temperatures dropped below freezing. Otherwise, they'd all freeze to death. What Justin didn't know was that he had sorely misjudged how far past Durango they had actually flown, and that it was more than 20 miles away. It wasn't until he reached the end of the gully that they had crashed in that he came into a clearing and he saw the true predicament they were in. They were literally in the middle of nowhere, lost in the heart of the mountains. Yet, he pressed on. After hours of hiking, he began to feel exhausted, not to mention that it was starting to get dark. Suddenly, he stumbled across what could be his saving grace, a small stream winding down the mountain. But it also meant that he had a decision to make: follow the banks of the stream and stay dry, or get in the shallow stream and walk down it. He would be able to get down the mountain much faster, but it also meant that he'd lose body heat faster being wet. Hoping that he made the right decision, he jumped into the stream and took off running, hoping to make up some time. And it wasn't long before he realized that running was probably a stupid thing to do. The stones in the stream were wet and slippery. God forbid he slipped in the river and got significantly injured. Then none of them would have any chance of making it out alive. Now, back at the wreck, Tommy saw that night was falling, and he decided to make some sort of shelter for him and Larry. In spite of the pain and the risk of further injury, he made several trips back to the wreck, bringing anything that he could find to build their shelter. Finally finished, they both climbed inside, resigned to the fact that they would not be rescued, at least probably not that night. Elsewhere on the mountain, Justin was still following the stream. He'd fallen a few times and was completely drenched and chilled down to the bone. He was scared that his movement wasn't going to be enough to keep him going. Worried what he was doing wasn't enough, he pulled out his phone. He knew that there was probably no chance of getting a signal, but he decided to check anyway. Nothing. He'd walk a bit and try. Walk a bit, try again. As he was going along, he saw a small clearing on top of a small hill. At that point, he decided to leave the stream and climb up the hill. To his amazement, he looked down at the screen and saw a single bar. Excited, he dialed a number. He heard someone pick up and he hurriedly began to explain the situation, worried that the call would be dropped. He was instantly crushed when he realized that the other person on the other end couldn't hear him. He hung up and ran around the area trying to get a better signal, and then he tried again. With this attempt, he was so relieved when they could hear him. Again, he rushed to explain the situation and was told that there was already an air patrol out looking for them. The team was dispatched when the three men failed to arrive back at the airport earlier that afternoon. Justin was patched through to the helicopter team, and he was actually able to guide him to his position. By this point, the sun had gone down and the seconds were ticking for the lives of the other two men who were already beginning to experience hypothermia. With Justin aboard the helicopter and equipped with night vision, they were now on a mission to find Larry and Tommy before it was too late. Sometime after the sun had set, Larry and Tommy suddenly heard the sound of a helicopter heading their way. Elated, Tommy jumped up, and as it got near, he began waving a piece of the plane in hopes that it would reflect light from the searchlight beam. Frustratingly, though, even though Justin was sure that the helicopter was in the right area, the density of the trees prevented them from being able to see the men on the ground. After several minutes of flying directly over them, the helicopter crew believed that Justin had probably been mistaken, and so they actually moved away to search another area. As the helicopter left, Larry and Tommy were left devastated. Surely their only chance of survival was gone. The helicopter flew around for a few more hours, but fuel began to run low, so they had to break it to Justin that they had to go back. Justin begged them for just one more sweep over the area that they first checked. Seeing his desperation, the helicopter crew relented. Just one more sweep. Already having given up, Tommy and Larry couldn't believe it when they heard the unmistakable sound of the chopper's rotors. A miracle. The helicopter was coming back, but this time it was flying slower. Once again, Tommy jumped up and began desperately waving the scrap of metal, but there was no indication from the helicopter that they could actually see them. Tommy was terrified that they would just leave again, and then he remembered that he had a camera in his pocket that he had been using during the vacation. Remember, this is 2002. No phones with cameras with unlimited photos. Tommy used the last 5 pictures on the film in the camera in a desperate attempt to get the helicopter's attention using the camera's flash. And as he took the last photo, the helicopter suddenly paused overhead. The helicopter's spotlight began sweeping over the area, and after a few tense moments, the beam of light landed on the wreck of the airplane. I cannot imagine the amount of relief that those two men must have felt in that moment, thinking that their rescue was just minutes away. But as the helicopter began looking for a place to land, the unthinkable happened. One of the helicopter's rotor blades hit a tree and flung the helicopter 70 feet down to the ground. Amazingly, everyone survived that crash too. That meant that Justin Kirkbride was in a plane crash and a helicopter crash in a single day and survived both. I legitimately believe that he had a better chance of winning the lottery twice in his life than what he went through that day. The poor guys on the ground were confused, not knowing what had just happened. The helicopter was there and then poof, gone. They were so close to being able to go home that when the helicopter just disappeared, they had absolutely no idea that the helicopter had also crashed. So Larry yelled out their location again and again, hoping that if the helicopter had landed farther away, that they would be able to hear them and find them faster. After an uncomfortably long time, Larry finally heard a voice. It wasn't the helicopter crew. It was a ground-based team who had also set out after the men were discovered missing. Justin and Larry and Tommy were finally able to get off the mountain 19 hours after the beginning of their ordeal. It's pretty unbelievable that not a single person died in either crash. And thankfully, Larry and Tommy went on to make full recoveries. All right, so here's where I ask for your help. As mentioned in my previous video, I am trying to help my family, in these hard economic times. And one of the ways is by trying to get my channel monetized. But I have made the decision that anything that I ever make, 10% of anything I ever make, will go to a charity chosen and voted on by you guys, my subscribers, and you will get to see the receipts. So if you want to help me help others as well, please like this video, comment below, subscribe, and let's try to help give back. It's time for the trivia question of the day. Okay, the answer to last week's trivia question was the latent phase, also known as the walking ghost phase. Shout out to Lindsay N1223, who was the only person to get the correct answer. Now for today's question. The first person to comment the correct answer down below will get a shout out in the next video. In 1954, a de Havilland Comet, the first passenger airliner, suddenly broke apart just 20 minutes into the flight. What caused the explosive decompression? Okay, so over the course of the Iraq War, almost 50 aircraft were shot down by Iraqi insurgents using anti-aircraft artillery or surface-to-air missiles. The guys in this next story were involved in the first attack. The Baghdad International Airport was key for the U.S. military and was used to deliver supplies and reinforcements. Now, very few civilian aircraft were allowed to use the strictly guarded airport, but mail carriers were one of the exceptions. That day, an Airbus A300 owned by DHL was taking off from the Baghdad airport, carrying mail from American soldiers back home to their loved ones. Aboard were 3 men: Eric, a Belgian, who was the captain of the flight. The co-pilot was Steve, another Belgian, and the flight engineer was Mario, who was Scottish. It's ironic that the plane was targeted by insurgents because there were no Americans on board. Now, the flight's first stop after leaving Baghdad was going to be the small country of Bahrain, where more U.S. soldiers were stationed. For the crew, it was a routine flight. They did it twice a day. Now, the crew was aware that during takeoff and landing, there was a chance of attack on the plane, but they tried not to worry about it. It had never happened before, so why should this time be any different? But what they didn't know was this time was going to be different. They were in the crosshairs of the Iraqi insurgents below. Without any warning, the men were blindsided when they felt a large bang and felt the airplane lurch. Suddenly, their instrument panel lit up and the cockpit was filled with sounds of multiple alarms. The biggest problem was that the plane indicated a loss of all hydraulic systems. Without them, they had lost all ability to control the direction of the plane. They couldn't climb, they couldn't descend, they couldn't turn. At the same time, alarms told them that the plane was leaning too far to one side and was at risk for stalling. When the missile hit the plane, it hit the left wing, creating a huge hole. Each of the three men instantly knew the dire situation that they were in. Now, for those who are not obsessed with plane crashes like me, there are two notable instances of planes losing all of their hydraulics. Now, the first happened in 1985 when Japan Airlines Flight 123, Tokyo to Osaka, lost all hydraulics following a structural failure in the tail. The plane crashed into Mount Takamagahara, and between the crash and the poor response to it, it resulted in 520 fatalities and only 4 survivors. Then in the US, the second one, 1989, United Airlines Flight 232 from Denver to Chicago attempted a landing in Sioux City, Iowa. In that case, one of the engines had exploded and shrapnel penetrated the hydraulics lines. In spite of the incredible efforts of the pilots, that flight attempted a landing that left 112 dead and 171 injured. Because of those past incidents, the pilots aboard the DHL plane were painfully aware that there was a really good chance that they weren't going to survive. There were no procedures or training or anything else to tell them what to do to make it out of this situation alive. It was up to them to figure it out. The plane had been climbing when it was hit and was stuck doing so. Around 12,000 feet up, the plane suddenly stopped climbing and just began to fall. And suddenly, just as suddenly, began to climb again without any input from the pilots. That pattern continued. Worried about what would happen if they just did nothing, the pilots decided to use the engines to lessen the climbs and the falls. So they would power up the engines during the periods of falling and power down the engines during the periods of climbing. Beyond that, they didn't really know what else to do. Because that wasn't complicated enough, the damage to the left wing was causing drag on that side, making the plane turn down to the left. So not only did they have to use the engines to try to flatten out their path, but now they had to simultaneously operate the left and right engines at different speeds to try to straighten out their path. You'd think that they'd have enough to be worried about, having just become the first civilian plane shot at during the Iraq War. The pilots were worried that as the plane slowly descended, that they might be attacked again, and they had every right to be afraid. Back on the ground, the insurgents launched a second missile in hopes that the second would succeed where the first had failed. Luckily, the second missile missed them. And the crazy thing is, they had no idea that that second missile happened until much later. Anyway, because of the curve of the plane's course, eventually the plane began to head towards the airport again. That meant a chance to land the plane, and they'd have one chance of getting it right. Mario, the flight engineer, manually cranked the landing gear down into place. But because nothing was going to plan, as the landing gear came down, it threw off the balance of the plane. The new drag on the plane caused the nose to go up, and the plane lost a good amount of speed. The stall warning blared. Knowing that they had to do something, they desperately pushed the throttles up, and the plane's engines powered up again. Over the radio, air traffic control informed them that if they could make it, there was a runway open and ready for them. All right, because something always goes wrong, can you guess what the new problem was? I'll give you a second. Where the wing had been hit, the fuel tank was punctured. So they had been leaking fuel. That tank was dangerously close to empty. If the tank was completely dry, it could cause the plane to tilt again dangerously and for them to lose all control because they weren't dealing with enough other crap. Right? Anyway, as they began their approach, they told the control tower that they wanted to declare an emergency. That allows them to land wherever they need and to have emergency services waiting for them. That meant that the fire department and ambulances would just be waiting below, right there. Then, after declaring the emergency, the pilots realized that they were coming in too high and that they wouldn't be able to safely land on any of the runways. To land safely, they would have to make a giant 22-mile circle to try to line up with the runway again. But there was no guarantee that they'd have the fuel or the altitude to make it safely around again, not to mention that the wing was on fire. And there's also the possibility of another missile attack. But they knew they had no choice. If they tried to land right then, knowing that they were too high, they would have come in too fast and at too steep an angle. There was no way that any of them would survive that. If it wouldn't have been a crash landing, it would have been a crash. So they began the go around, and miraculously, they made it. As they began their second approach, they tried their best to use the engines to line up the severely damaged plane and the runway. As they came in for the landing, they were still going too fast, and they were worried that the landing gear might rip off, but they were not willing to try a third attempt. It was now or never. As they got closer to the ground, a freaking crosswind added to the situation. Now they were being pushed away from the runway that they had tried so hard to line up with. They had to increase their speed to correct their position, which meant that they were going even faster than they had been before. Then they had to worry that they'd missed the runway altogether. And because I can't make this crap up, just before the plane touched down, a new alarm in the cockpit started. Terrain, pull up. The plane was telling them that they were too close to the ground for how fast they were going, and even the plane was freaking out. But it was go time, whether they were ready or not. The plane came down hard on the ground, and immediately the landing gear collapsed. The plane skidded off the side of the runway and careened across the desert ground, but the plane eventually slowed and came to a stop. Silence. Elated and shocked to be alive, the three men got their asses out of the plane. The crew were hugging and laughing and congratulating each other, just freaking exhilarated. Seeing the fire trucks coming to meet them, they began to walk away from the plane. But then the merriment was abruptly over when they heard a voice screaming at them, telling them, "Don't move another step." Now, you're not going to believe this shit. Just when they finally thought they were safe on the ground, the firefighters were screaming that the plane had just come to a stop in a fucking minefield surrounding the airport. If they took another step, they could possibly get blown up. The firefighters reassured them, though, that they were coming to get them. And they very slowly and deliberately drove the fire truck out to the men, aware that they were playing a dangerous game of Russian roulette. Once the fire truck reached the men, it stopped and reversed and drove back out over its tracks, back out of the minefield. The three men were able to finally walk in that path back to the airport in the tracks of that truck. They were finally safe. Okay, So today, there is a program called PCA, or Propulsion Controlled Aircraft. In planes that have lost all hydraulics, pilots would put input commands into the computer, which would tell the engines to take over controlling the plane's directions when hydraulics are lost. Now, unfortunately, the FAA has decided that the program is too expensive to be mandatory and that the financial cost outweighs the risk to lives. The FAA says that since total hydraulic loss is so rare, it doesn't make sense to implement it. Tell that to the over 600 people who have died in similar crashes. Anyway, that's it for today. If you want to see more from me, like this video, subscribe, answer the trivia question, leave a comment below telling me about your favorite survival stories. And as always, don't forget to be merry, but stay morbid.